Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Jean. I'm the pastor at First Christian Church in Helena, in Montana. And if I had to name one good thing that has come from the pandemic, it's that we're all able to connect and collaborate with people from all across the nation, which I think is just one of the coolest things. So, no matter where you are, each of us gathered here today sits on the land of our Indigenous ancestors who came before us. Regardless of where you call home, these ancestors lived there, and Native people continue to live among us today. These people are the past, present, and future caretakers of our land. We take time now to recognize our collective occupation of stolen land and the countless individuals who have been forcefully removed from their homes by colonization. We remember also those who lost their lives and livelihoods in the process of colonization. Colonization is not something that happened in the far off past. We continue to inhabit the land of the people who, though displaced, are still living amongst us. This is not just an issue of the past. Though it may look different today, the oppression and genocide of our Indigenous siblings continues. The US Department of Justice found that American Indian women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than the average American. Thousands of Indigenous women go missing across the nation each year, and very few of their disappearances are ever investigated by law enforcement. In our country, 1 in 3 Native Americans are living in poverty, and these communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Colonization is something that happens each and every day in our communities, and it is a way of thinking and operating that is deeply ingrained in our way of life as North Americans. Despite all the odds and the actions of individuals who aim to destroy them, Native communities have demonstrated resilience and resistance in the face of marginalization for many hundreds of years. In a moment, we'll have a short time of silence. Use this time to think about the ways you may have been complacent or apathetic in regard to the oppression of Indigenous people. Take a moment to consider whose land you occupy today and what responsibility you have to your Indigenous siblings in light of that occupation. Think about how you might be able to advocate and take a stand for the Indigenous people living in your community. And imagine what our world might look like if we each actively worked to interrogate the false narratives we've been made to believe, and if we all committed to creating a more equitable world for all. I invite you now into a time of quiet reflection.
Will you join me in prayer? Gracious God, creator of all that is and will be, give us ears to hear today. Open our hearts and minds to new understanding. Keep us curious and wondering at what we might learn, what we might discover about our world, about our brothers and sisters, about ourselves. And when we go from this place at the end of our time together, make us courageous to make a difference in the world in which we live, with our neighbors, within ourselves, and with all we encounter. This day we place in your hands. Amen.
As a minister for Indigenous Justice for the Center of Indigenous Ministries, Disciples of Christ, I would like to introduce Nathan Hill this afternoon. I have that pleasure that I find meaningful to me. Nathan and I have known each other for quite a while. And Nathan is one of, I think, one of the insightful folks that we have in the denomination that comes to this work in a way that matters. Nathan is, you may or may not know, but is one of the core anti-racism trainers for the denomination, which just says a lot when there's only a few white men who are doing that today, and white and non-native at that. He brings about with him an insight that I find meaningful that helps me become a better person when I talk to him and is with him. I think that you'll find that what he has to say will be helpful to you in your own ministries, wherever your ministry might lead you. But more than anything, I think what Nathan does is take a piece of understanding that the doctrine of discovery has been a core piece that has led to racism in the United States and Canada, and he has worked on finding a way of being able to talk about that through his own lenses, and so that is understandable. And so as you listen to Nathan, I would encourage you to wonder, how do I go about telling my own story in a way that people can hear? So my pleasure to introduce Reverend Nathan Hill, and to have him with us this morning.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with the Northern Lights region and broader community who have joined us today. And I'm really was honored to be asked by Dave to be a part of this and to share some of my story and some of my work. And I'm going to take a moment. I'm coming to you from the East Coast. I'm a pastor. I'm the pastor at University Christian Church in Hyattsville, Maryland, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. So, we have definitely been feeling some of the stress and challenges of these past month or so of transition and political realities in this area. It's been an interesting time to be a pastor here. A great congregation I serve that's diverse and multicultural, multiracial, and where we are on many paths of trying to figure out where God is leading us, as I'm sure so many of your churches are in the same journey. So I'm just honored to share some of the story today. And I have a keynote that I'll share, but just a little bit more. One, I do want to also acknowledge and honor the land which I'm coming to you from this morning, the land of the Piscataway and Anacostan people, ancestral lands that was cultivated and cared for. And so I honor them for that gift, for that legacy, and also recognize too that their continued struggle for recognition and for justice. The Piscataway people are still not federally recognized, and so that process is ongoing as they seek to have their history honored and their legacy and their place in our story, in the story of this state, in this area. But originally, I'm from Oklahoma. I'm originally from what it used to be called Indian Territory, which I'll talk about in a few moments, and from a town called Anadarko, very interesting place to grow up. Rich with just a strong number of Native American national headquarters, tribal headquarters in that area and right around that area. So I had quite an experience growing up there that I didn't fully understand until moving away, going somewhere else. But I honor that to the land that I grew up and was nurtured, belonged to the Kiowa and Comanche nations. And so I honor them as well as in their continued struggle for liberation, for freedom, and for their voice and for flourishing. And so I do all of this work in recognition of those gifts that have nurtured me. And I acknowledge too that what you're going to hear today is still a work in progress. I'm in the midst of my Doctor of Ministry coursework at Phillips Theological Seminary. And so it's been a journey. And that journey has included a trip to Israel and Palestine a year ago before the pandemic hit. It's included a trip to Tucson, to the border, through border links, and some other great dialogue, as well as Winter Talk, which has been a gift to me to deepen my experience and put more language for me to talk about this and unpack it and share it with others. So it's very much a work in progress. So if it feels a little messy at times, it's because I'm still a mess, pretty much. All right. Okay. So I'm just honored to share with you. And I'm going to share my screen now, and I will be happy to make my presentation accessible as a PDF file, if that would be helpful. I tried to mark where things came from as best I could, but I'm always happy to do that. So again, it's an honor to be with you. I want to just jump right in to honor our time together. to talk about breaking bread on stolen land, understanding and resisting the doctrine of discovery. So I want to begin with this image. I love images. I'm an image person. And this is an image that I grew up around in Oklahoma. And then I was blessed to serve as an associate minister in Dallas for 4 years. And actually I was followed by the incredible Colin McRaney, who's on with us. And I would see these signs quite often in those areas. Now out here in the DC area, land is very expensive. So you don't see these kinds of signs as often. But maybe in your area where you are, there are still these signs that pop up. Future home of such and such church in some empty field, often at the edge of town, often a field that's not used for farming or anything. It's sort of uncultivated. And I think about these images a lot because for me and how I was growing up in the church, I was raised in my understanding of what successful church is it is a church that is expanding and growing. It's a church that is buying land and building buildings and then adding onto that building and building bigger buildings and now even satellite campuses spread throughout the community. Certainly in this last year, some of that has been shaken up with Zoom life and pandemic life. But this still image for a lot of us, I think, is how we were taught, even as pastors, as leaders, as the sign that the church that God was at work in that church. And that God was on the move because that church was growing and expanding, bursting at the seams. And the church needed land for its own to stake its claim, to root itself, and to continue to grow. But so I just want to acknowledge that it's a beautiful image. If your church is in the midst of that journey, I just want to celebrate that. It is a sign of faithfulness, a stewardship of growth. And our church, our denomination, Disciples of Christ, has had a long effort to expand our witness and expand the number of our congregations because God is still on the move. But I wonder what you would think, what we'd all think if we come upon a continent, right, an entire continent with a big O sign that said future home of God's church, right? Like who would have the guts to plant that kind of sign, right? To claim an entire continent before really even knowing a lot about that continent and its peoples and the cultures and the wisdom and the resources therein, just to go ahead and say, this is where we're going to expand and claim as God's community, claim as our own, so that God's blessing can go out among the people. I think it's a dissonant image, maybe. It's a challenging image to think of the audacity for which to do that. And yet there is a reality in our history that we are all, as we gather today in history, that has shaped us, that we've been taught and has formed us and has given us different narratives which shape our lives. This is some of the reality of how we got to where we are today, and to a landscape that is fractured, a landscape that is fragmented. We live, we worship, we raise our families, we enjoy the fruits of on indigenous lands. This map, and I know it's a sketch. I know it's some of these maps are always difficult to be completely accurate. There's always some summarizing and things, but a glimpse of it in AD 1500 of just how diverse and thriving and flourishing that indigenous communities were here across this continent, on this part of God's creation. Such rich cultures and resources, and certainly it wasn't perfect. There were communities that suffered and struggled just like our own, and but there was also stories that we have now lost as colonization, as expansion unfolded, as settlers came and wanted more land and pushed west, sometimes uprooting lives, destroying communities, and losing incredibly rich cultural resources that have harmed us, and we have no way of seemingly of replacing. If you've not done it before, you might check out the website native-land.ca to see where the land you were raised upon or that has been meaningful to you, what indigenous nations and communities once called that land home, or may still call that land home, and may still care for and honor creation in relationship with it. Because I think this is part of my journey, is to continue to claim my story and to tell my story and make sense of this time in which we live in a fractured landscape with injustice and loss, that I feel called as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, to address in the ways I can, and to live into a more whole and abundant creation. How did we get here, though? And by one of the things I'm amazed by, one of the things that floored me, let me go back, that just that there was a great article in New York Times just, I think this month or last month, just very recently, about indigenous authors who are writing science fiction stories and have made the most fascinating claim that a lot of our dominant culture right now, we love apocalyptic stories. We love stories like The Walking Dead, and stories where the world is on the edge of collapse and everything is going crazy. Civilization is falling apart. We love those stories. And for these indigenous writers and others who say, well, that story is our reality from the devastation and loss that we have experienced as people and as communities. How did we get here? How did we get to such an apocalyptic reality for one of our neighbors, for those of us especially who are white, who have been benefited from this environment, while we have maybe experienced a different reality? Dr. David Anderson Hooker is doing work with Reconciliation Ministry, and I recommend his work. He says that we tell stories but live narratives. And he says that to differentiate between stories and narratives. And that stories are, shorter, and they're things that we talk about and we tell, but narratives are those stories stringed together. Narratives are how what shapes our lives and shapes how we tell the stories and how we understand our reality. So it's important for us to understand the narratives that shape us. And I want to begin, and over the next few minutes, talk about the Bible, some of the narratives that have brought us to this moment. Talk about the narrative of conquest, the doctrine of discovery itself, define that, and then even get a little personal and talk about disciples of Christ, our Stone Campbell narratives, and hopefully offer some insight for us to have some excellent conversation together. Munther Isaac, who is a Palestinian theologian, works at the Bethlehem Bible College. He's an evangelical Lutheran pastor. This book is incredible. It's one of my enjoyments since meeting him a year ago. Which is all about promised land and about the importance of land. What does the Bible say about land? And sometimes we don't think about it this way, even though we read these stories so much and we've gone to Sunday school, but land matters, he says. The biblical narrative is a story about land. Now, we tend to think of sometimes it's about redemption, it's about salvation, it's these big consummation, these big terms. But he's right. On a level, land is a huge focus and theme, an essential story to the entire unfolding of the Bible, which I'll touch upon as we go. We pick up, beginning, of course, with the Garden of Eden, right? And what he says in the book, before I jump to that passage, he says the Garden of Eden, which I never thought about it this way, is the story of the whole Bible. That God creates this beautiful place in which we are entrusted to live, creates humanity to be stewards. Humanity messes things up. We get the creation gets messed up. Humans are kicked out, but then God comes back in and says, let's figure out how we can fix this, restore a new way of being and living together in balance, in care, in wholeness, right? And that continues into stories of Exodus, of liberation, for the slave people being led out of Egypt into the promised land, being offered a land where they can have their own, they can live in perhaps peace and freedom, and they can thrive and flourish. But quickly, even in that narrative, we begin to hear the conflicts around land. Let me see here. I couldn't see my, good. And Deuteronomy, and in the text about for the people before they enter the promised land, giving them some ways to live and to shape their lives together in community, God seems to make clear. But as for the towns of these people, or at least Moses, as Moses is speaking to the people, but as for the towns of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God. We began to pick up in Deuteronomy a sense of the conflict that the people are going to face, and a sense too that God demands for us to live holy and sacred lives, fine, but then gives permission. A God of love, God of creation, we certainly experience in different ways through Jesus, but this image now of a God who also says, I want you to murder. I want you to take people out. I want you to uproot people that are already living in this land that you are about to enter and that I am giving you. In particular, this takes even more form in Joshua, a book that some of us may have preached on from time to time, but is not very popular as a preaching option most Sundays. Of course, many of us remember singing Joshua Fit the Battle for Jericho in choir or Sunday school growing up. And it does seem like a powerful story. I went to a nonviolent protest once where that was the image used. The Jericho story was used to call for the walls of injustice to come down, which is fine. But Joshua is a violent book. It is about conquest. This is a painting by Nicholas Poussin, which captures just the violence of war, of conquest, of people struggling against people, lives and blood being shed for land, for a claim over land. Joshua is a hard book to understand, and it's complex. So I don't want to easily dismiss a book from the Bible. I want to sit with it, even the discomfort and the questions it offers me and challenges me with. And certainly I have heard people read the book of Joshua from a sense of spiritual warfare, a sense of obedience, that this is a book that really encourages us to be obedient to what God wants and trust God in the midst of it. Certainly there are times in our lives where it feels like we're in the midst of spiritual warfare, or indeed that we must figure out how to be obedient and trust that God will lead us through conflict and challenge. But there's no getting around the fact that, in the words of Dr. Walter Brueggemann, that this text wounds and continues to wound. In that story of Jericho, for instance, when the walls come tumbling down, what happens next? Well, God's people rush in and slaughter every man, woman, child, and livestock. That story, that part of the story, I don't remember hearing in Sunday school, in other words. And now there are complex stories and other pieces throughout. There are bits of resistance in the book of Joshua, including Rahab and the Gibeonites, which offer us a sense that perhaps even those who were recording this story or editing it or were aware of the dissenting viewpoints even from within Judaism, with Jewish practice then and belief, that even God said to wipe everybody out, that there were people who survived. There were people who were not moved out. And in fact, at the end of Joshua, in chapter 24, which has sort of started my focus of this work, the people have gathered there with Joshua, their leader, and he sort of consecrates them. He has a moment of where they recommit themselves to follow God in this new land. And what's ironic about it is that the work has not been done. Not everyone has been driven out. Not all of the war and conquest was finished. But for whatever reason, they've come to enough point that they feel like we need to stand before God and recommit ourselves to this life together. And this particular passage is chilling to me, challenging. When you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I handed them over to you. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove out before you the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. In other words, God is the mover here. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built, and you live in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. In particular, as I studied this book, that verse there at the end hit home for me. So I think about being a white man in the context in which I grew up in Oklahoma, what was called Indian Territory, and even here in Maryland and in Dallas, and all the times I have enjoyed the fruit of this amazing slice of creation that in my life, and how it has nurtured me and enabled me to thrive in so many different ways. And as a reminder too that conquest is a reality. There is a loss, a deep loss of life. There's a deep loss of tradition. There's a deep loss of history, of knowing who we really are when we lose even what came before. That word Canaanites invites us to dig deeper. And I recommend the article some time ago by Robert Warrior, Cowboys, Canaanites, and Indians, where he invites us to read these texts from the eyes of the Canaanites. And that word in Hebrew, one of the translations, is people indigenous to Canaan. So I'm left sitting as I think about my own American history. I think about, again, where I grew up and how I was nurtured by this creation. And I think about those lives who had to be removed, or maybe didn't have to be, but were removed and destroyed to make this life possible for me, for my ancestors, and even for those who come after me. Later in the gospel, we are reminded too, and of course, that idea of promised land just is woven throughout Scripture, and then follows with the exile and the wars and the return and of over this piece of land where the people felt God was present and God was holy and God was in covenant with the people there. And there's such struggle that continues to our present day, as a year ago visiting Israel and Palestine. But even in Jesus's journey, Jesus came to them at the end of Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Munther Isaac reminds us that the Hebrew word for earth and land are the same. All authority in heaven and on land, all land has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. So the birth of the church, the sense that the church was called to go and spread the good news of Jesus even beyond that one corner of the world, all across to the ends of the earth. And I think that this idea of a universalization of Christ comes into play there, that Christ isn't just confined to that space, but to that one, to Jerusalem, to one area of Galilee, but Christ suddenly belongs to all of creation in this emerging theology of the Christian movement and the early church. And so we must go and spread this universalized Christ, but not just require people to come to this one place, but go to the ends of the earth to share the good news, to spread the church, to grow, to expand, and to live into what we have experienced through Jesus. Which brings us to the doctrine of discovery, which is what we're here today to talk about. Our General Assembly resolution in 2017 defines it as the body of work beginning in the 15th century with a series of papal bulls and theological statements justifying the age of discovery, the colonization, conquest, subjugation of lands and peoples around the world. And I highly recommend using the resolution as a starting point for our conversation as disciples and in churches, if you haven't already made access to that yet. It's a great resource. Janine Hill Fletcher writes in The Sin of White Supremacy, the theology of conquest was a sophisticated project informed by classically trained theologians. As just we started with Scripture, we started recognizing that even in ancient Israel, that there were theological arguments and justifications, that God was blessing and ordaining these certain actions for the people to go into the promised land and to treat the people they encountered in a certain way, to make war upon them, to take what God had promised from them by force, if need be. And in this, the theology of conquest that we have received, that has created this reality in which we live, and this broken and fractured landscape in which we live, also was supported by the best the theology had to offer. Pope Alexander VI was able to go and refer to some of his best theologians and best minds from the most sophisticated seminaries of the day to make a justification for conquest. As new lands were discovered, people there, yes, as new lands were stumbled upon, maybe more like it. And what do we do about these communities and these people that we have found in this land, which surely has rich resources that will not only enrich the monarchs and the powers of Europe, but also God's holy church? Wow, what if God's holy church had access to that gold and silver? Oh, how many more cathedrals could we have built? Having been to Spain years ago in seminary and seen many of the cathedrals, it was a reality of how much wealth and value was ripped from Africa and from the Americas in honor of building these opulent houses for God. And it was done with the backing of the best theologians, wrestling with their questions of the day, which tells us too, as we wrestle with this, that we need to bring our theological A game. We can't just do a little surface dive, but we got to be willing to dig deep and examine all of these narratives that have been offered to us. Willie James Jennings in The Christian Imagination points out that the white supremacy project was conceptual and material, or is conceptual and material, imposing a hierarchy that placed white Europeans and their political, cultural, and religious and intellectual life above other cultures through violence and conquest of land and human bodies. And this painting here from the Smithsonian National Art Gallery, I love that there's a priest at the back of the painting, right at the edge of the slide, if you can see that. That this was a hand-in-hand project, again, with the church and with military and power and monarchies and empire. But this idea of taking the idea and then forcing it drills it down really simple for me, that it begins with an idea, not the audacity, this idea that our way is better, that we're the ones who are in charge of history. We're the ones who are leading and shaping history. And we have a divine command to do as such. And so it is our job to bring our way of life and force it upon the people we meet, whether they want it or not, to classify people, to put them in a hierarchy and systems of domination, so that we can do what we feel God is telling us to do. This comes out clearly in the Requirimiento, which was sort of the instructions given to these explorers, these folks that were going out, these conquerors that were going out to colonize and claim land in the name of empire, making clear that if you do not come along with our way, if you do not become a Christian, if you do not believe what we believe, well, with the help of God, we shall enter your country and make war against you in all the ways and manners that we can. We shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And we protest. This is just the sickening reality of this. We protest the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of the powers inflicting such savagery and brutality upon these people. Wow. I even as we bring this up, I recognize that this introduces trauma. This introduces such pain into and to our history and to our space here and to our conversation, to see how quite clearly the church at large was a front participation in the destruction and the dehumanization of so many people and the enslavement. And John, who is going to speak later, John Gahate, who I just admire so much, in a winter talk a couple of years ago, he put it this way: the first question for Columbus in Spain was, are they human? And if the question is, if that is in account, if that question is open to debate, then of course you can do whatever you want. You know, you have freedom to move people away from the land because they don't know what to do with it, and you are the ones who are going to teach them how really to live in relationship to the land. The fact that this question was in the air meant that the doctrine absolved or prevented accountability for the actions of many, he says. And so that, hey, they didn't, it's their own fault that they didn't do what we asked them to do. We wanted to be very nice to them, but they resisted, and so it's their own fault. They get what they deserve. And that we're only doing what God wanted us to do. So many narratives of this way of power was twisted in favor of conquest, and so that even to this day, I still don't believe the Catholic Church has at least repudiated the doctrine of discovery. I know that has been a conversation, and I haven't read recently if that has been officially done. There's still a lack of accountability and recognition too often for the devastating losses we've had. I'm going to show a short video here. I'm trying to keep an eye on time. I'll just show the first few minutes. This is from the National Museum of the American Indian, a great video to use. The whole piece is about 12 minutes and does touch upon manifest destiny, which I'm not going to get into as much. But
By the early 19th century, the U.S. was rapidly growing, both in size and power. Land-hungry and ambitious, the new country was also drastically changing its policies towards the Indian nations. And nowhere was this more evident than in the treaties.
The United States' primary interest in treaty making was to acquire Indian land. And so the treaties were used for that purpose, especially as the United States found itself in a position to pretty much dictate the terms of the treaty. And so the treaties morphed from this friendship and reciprocity sort of relationship into a very one-sided thing.
There's almost a mythology about this, that somehow when the Pilgrims arrived, they were dragging land behind them. There was no land brought here. The land here was Native nations. And this is what the United States needed. It's what it wanted. They wanted all of it. They wanted everything.
The greed came in. Well, we have a little tract here now we need a little more. And well, we need to go make another treaty. We didn't understand that eventually those treaty-making processes ended up to the acquisition of all of our ancestral homeland. That land was a part of us. That land helped us be. That land was who we were and who we are.
The command of removal came unexpectedly upon most of us. There was a time that we noticed several overloaded wagons were passing our home, yet we did not grasp the meaning. Then one day, wagons stopped. We were to be taken away and leave our homes, never to return.
pause there. Just I recommend the whole video. As we did quite a jump there from the requerimiento to now the United States' expanse and hunger for land and for a unified sort of continent from coast to coast. And but I think because you see the narratives that even in the way that the Indian problem came to be described and was addressed by government officials, the question lingered in the air was, are they human? Sort of these people are a problem to be dealt with, not people to be in relationship and to treat as equals, as those to be in dialogue and learning and sharing with the abundant resources in this part of creation. So these narratives that started of empire and religion and Christianity, of conquest, they have continued into the United States, into the way that the history of this country has treated our indigenous neighbors, indigenous nations, removal and conquest and cheating and treaties, broken treaties, and genocide. This took shape ultimately with of Indian boarding schools and an effort to Christianize Indians, to civilize them, to have them be like us, white people, European descendants, so that they speak like us and they worship like us, they talk, they do life like us, and they order their the way that they care for the families and do economic participation all like us. And this becomes a theme through conquest and even to today, in the ways that indigenous communities are still treated as a problem to be solved, or punished for being different, for still lingering on to traditions which have almost been lost, in many cases have almost all been lost. And it leads us to the realities, and I appreciate Laura Jean sharing some of these statistics too, that sexual assault among rape and sexual assault for Native American, Alaska Native women are more than 2.5 times more likely than women in the U.S. in general. Poverty rates are dramatically higher, twice that of the general population and almost 3 times that of white Americans. Suicide is the 8th leading cause of death. And these statistics are a few years old, so that may have changed. And then the nightmare of a reality of the situation of treaties, of land, of removal that has brought about a radically different justice, departments of the ways of dealing with justice, court jurisdictions, law enforcement, which make sometimes prosecuting crime in Indian country very, very difficult, if possible. And of course, the immense loss of identity, sovereignty, language, and culture that has devastated lives by the intentional efforts by political and religious authorities. Well, where does the Stone Campbell movement fit into this history? I know for those of you in the Northern Lights, you're aware of the Yakima mission, and I'm sure that has been part of your dialogue partner too. But more broadly than that too, how do we trace the narratives? These narratives about land, of conquest, of that's mine, and I want to move into that, and I want to expand. Alexander Campbell has been my focus in my work, and I will get to Barton Stone eventually, and some of the others that are influential in the founding of the Stone Campbell movement. But Campbell's fascinating because he's written so much, and so in some ways it's right there in the open for us to dig into and think about. Campbell came to this country, of course, leaving behind a very fractured landscape of a lot of religious divisions and violence, which is something I want to learn more about, because I know he and his father and their families, they came to these shores looking for opportunity, leaving behind a landscape, like I said, that was so fractured politically and religiously that it made life hard, where you could get into trouble for even hanging out with the wrong kind of Presbyterian. He was a Scotch-Irish immigrant, and he took to America quite quickly. He was very excited, I think, and embraced sort of the ethos, and that this new, what then was still a fledgling nation figuring itself out. He became a prolific writer and a prolific speaker and debater and an educator. And there's a lot of ideas I think we can still celebrate from him, including a sense of independent thought, or reading the Bible on our own, a love of, appreciation for congregational polity, for some democratic ideals, and for being a scholar. I think those are things that still reverberate from his witness. But he was also quite a character, and something of a jerk, which I continue to find out about. He founded Bethany College in 1840, which still, continues on and exists as one of our institutions in Bethany, West Virginia. What I think for me, what changed Campbell a lot was land. When he came to the shores, they had no land, not a lot of money. They were itinerant preachers, so life wasn't particularly amazing for them. But he married his wife, Margaret, in 1812, I believe. So about 3 years after he came. And as a gift, his father, John Brown, not the same John Brown associated with Harper's Ferry, deeded 300 acres of farmland and a house in present-day Bethany, West Virginia, valued at the time about $10,000. And then over the course of his life, he added to his property and wealth. So when he died, he was worth something like $7 million in our current day values. I mean, he did well. One of the interesting things, too, was that when his friends and family would come to him and ask for, like, they wanted to get farmland in Indiana or Ohio, he would be happy to help them, lend them money with the land as collateral. And so that when their farms went under, Campbell also suddenly had land in Indiana and Ohio that belonged to him and that he cared for. He was hired quite a number of people, and of course, I believe inherited slaves through Margaret's family, and that's an aspect of the story that I think causes sometimes us discomfort as disciples to talk about. But he also brought in like an Irish farmer to tend to his goats or sheep that he had and things. And so what's interesting about this too is all of this undergirds the life he was able to lead, a prolific writing and prolific travel and prolific debating as he built up this movement. One of the things that Douglas Foster, in his book, A Life of Alexander Campbell, which is a very interesting read, he says it's quite clear as you read and understand him that Campbell believed that the masses of the people should defer to the people who are most gifted to lead, the educated, far-sighted, natural aristocrats, such as himself. So it's kind of a little jarring to think of this congregational polity sense that he sort of gave us in our DNA. And yet he was very much a Jeffersonian in style, like a Thomas Jefferson, that there were those who were smart and brilliant, and they should really call the shots for everybody else. There was an elitism to him that Douglas Foster argues was part of his white nationalist, white supremacist framework that he was shaped by and that he took to quite rapidly. And so he would write things like this in the Millennial Harbinger: in our country's destiny is involved the destiny of Protestantism, and in its destiny, the destiny of all the nations of the world. God has given an awful charge to Protestant England and Protestant America, the Anglo-Saxon race, for which is not of Christendom only, but of all the world. And he just doubles down on this hierarchy. To us especially, he has given the new world and all of its hidden treasures with all the arts and sciences of the old. That Europe, Asia, and Africa look to Protestant America as the wonder of the age, and exerting a preponderating influence on the destinies of the world. I mean, Campbell has, it's easy for us to criticize this now too, but I think his ideas were not that uncommon, and still in the things we talk of, the narratives of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, continue to abound. Campbell believed too that if God's church could come together, if the gospel could be spread, and he thought that in Protestant America, in this fledgling U.S., that it was possible. It was possible to happen. He thought then Jesus would come back and solve all of our problems, right? But of course, the complexities of human life and the Civil War, which challenged him, really made him a little more cynical as he got later on in life about that vision. Of course, the sense of this landscape, to return to that our country has this destiny, and so we need to expand. We need to share the gospel. We need to get the gospel out there from shore to shore, shape disciples and continue to shape disciples in both our mission field work and our theology. We began to call ourselves this idea of a frontier, that we are a frontier movement. And just like the Methodists and others borrowed some of that language as well, used some of that language. And in Journey of Faith, which is the history of disciples that some of you may have taken or read, right away in the second chapter, the highly favorable setting for the emergence of a significant new Christian movement was to be the United States of America, newly formed from virgin land by immigrant people. Virgin land, really? Those hardy and adventurous persons who had come to America's shores in the colonial period had discovered that large areas of land sparsely inhabited made possible religious diversity and experimentation scarcely imagined before. What is true is that Campbell argued some about slavery. Ultimately, he was willing to pass on the issue of slavery because he wanted to keep this movement going. He wanted the institution, and his white supremacist values meant that, well, Black people, even though he believed God cared for them, God really valued white people more, and white people needed to lead. And so what was going on to African slaves was not something that he needed to spend a lot of time on. And likewise, the indigenous communities, something he wrote a couple of letters about when the Cherokee were removed. He had some dialogue about, but it did not seem to be of interest to him or a significant focus of his theology. And then that leads into this mostly white Protestant movement, even imagining our history, echoing these false histories that this land was sparsely inhabited. And so when we were moving in, it was like there was just a vacant sign. There was one of those church signs that said future church here. Black Elk said, only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery. I'm recognizing time here too, but this brings me, because I want to go even more personal. I think it's an invitation for all of us who are part of the Stone Campbell movement to do our work, to take these, how even our family stories and our faith stories have been wrapped up in this story of conquest. And I'm from Oklahoma, born and raised there. And in Southwest, you see the area that says Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Caddo, Wichita, Delaware. That's the area on the screen. And of course, Indian Territory was given to some nations in agreement for them to move from land that settlers wanted in the East, along the Trail of Tears, taking so much life and such loss along the way, and as well from other parts of the continent. People uprooted and moved to this land, which at first they thought was pretty much a wasteland. It wasn't very valuable. But of course, what happens in history is that pretty soon white folks go, wait a minute, there's some good farmland here, there's some resources here. And that would even get worse when oil was discovered and the oil boom unfolded. And so what you had to happen over time was that land was given, and then slowly the government came in and said, well, you all really don't need all that much land. So we're gonna divvy it back up. We'll give you all back some of it, and we're gonna take what's the rest. Into the story, into that expansion of the gospel, because this is territory where God's church needs to expand. That here comes the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, the Stone Campbell movement. In particular, even my home church in Anadarko, First Christian Church, Anadarko. According to Oklahoma Christian, still later, when the Kiowa, Comanche, and Wichita cattle lands were opened by a lottery, the Board of Church Extension, our own church extension, purchased building sites in the town sites of Anadarko, Lawton, and Hobart before any of these lands were assigned other winners of the lottery. These were held in trust for churches yet to be planted. This is the church where I was baptized. It's the church where I shared communion and served as a deacon and ran the sound system and was nurtured and challenged and messed up sometimes, but was also loved in my relationship and experienced the very beginnings of my call to ministry. Interesting enough, too, my first church job was in Lawton at First Christian Church in Lawton, in a part-time position there, leading praise music for one of their worship services. So I've got sort of a double part of this story. And so and this is a church too that in Anadarko, where I grew up, which is close to 50%, 45% Native American, made up of Wichita, Caddo, Delaware, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache peoples. It's a church that is 99% white, that is highly segregated. And I still remember the time when, even though I went to high school with so many of my friends who were Native, and we laughed and we enjoyed the rich cultural resources of this community that was offered to us so often in school and in the community, I said to one of the elders, I said, why aren't we reaching out and connecting with our indigenous neighbors? And the elder said to me, they have their churches and we have our churches. You see, the hierarchy, which shaped me, whether as much as it blessed me to be a part of a loving community of faith, it also shaped me. And those words from Joshua, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built, and you live in them. You eat of the fruit of vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. So I must ask, what does communion mean when we partake of fruits from stolen land? We lift up the bread and the cup are given to us from this creation which our ancestors and our systems and institutions have fractured and continue to fracture and destroy and dehumanize our brothers and sisters, our siblings. I take a little bit of, I'm watching time here. And so I'll close with some of this here. Of course, I always look to Jesus for answers and for next steps. Matthew 15, 21 through 28 is one of the challenging texts of the story of Canaanite woman. Jesus is going along with his disciples and Jesus is tired. The Canaanite woman cries out for help. She wants her daughter to be healed and Jesus ignores her. The disciples tell her to go away, but she persists. And finally, Jesus has this exchange with her where he says to her, we don't give bread to the fit for, the people at the table, the master's table, to the dogs, right? We don't give food from the table to the dogs. He essentially calls this woman a dog. And I've heard every variation of this text. I've heard people say that, oh, Jesus must have been telling a joke, cross-cultural humor. Jesus was testing her faith, right? Or something was lost in translation or something like that. Some way to excuse Jesus here from calling this woman a dog in her time of need. But she comes right back and resists the dehumanizing term, subverts it to even say, but even the dogs around the master's table get scraps. I need help. I'm a human being. I am a child of God. I am part of this creation. And Jesus changes his mind. He changes, he shifts. If you're willing to go along that route, if you're willing, and heals her daughter. One of the things I think about is that Jesus was likely raised within a narrative of the book of Joshua, of conquest. That the Canaanites, the people, the indigenous to this land in which he lived and did his ministry, they were not part of God's story anymore. They were outside of God's story. And so he didn't need to listen to her. He could ignore her and go on with his ministry because his ministry was for God's chosen people. But the woman doesn't stop crying out with courage for justice. Jesus hears her. Are we hearing those who are crying out for justice now? Are we, like Jesus, willing to examine the narratives that we have been given and shaped us and move in a new direction and change course? And ultimately, since this text talks about the table, what kind of table do we envision at the heart of God's community? Is it a table where some get scraps, where all find nourishment and care? Are we able to do the real theological work to get there? Growing up in Oklahoma, I was shaped by all these narratives of the Sooner Schooner, of celebrating those who came in and stole land ahead of the land runs, stole land even from those who were waiting in line to steal the land. Narratives that celebrated this in schools, in public schools, where we'd have a land run day, which some schools in Oklahoma have finally begun to stop doing. Imagine if you're an indigenous kid in school having to celebrate this loss again of people as if it was a glorious event for the community. And even the ways our history is forgotten. The bottom pictures from the Cattle Mounds in Texas, aware of the spiral mounds in Oklahoma, and the history that we have lost about this land that was not sparsely inhabited, but had flourishing communities. So we must reclaim stories, friends. Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Community is to be formed, common memory must be created. From George Erasmus, Dene Elder. We have work to do, to listen to our indigenous elders and leaders and communities, to listen to neighbors, to listen to each other, and to reclaim our own stories and reclaim how even we have been shaped by this land and by the narratives. And ultimately, to return to Mumford Isaac, we must restore relationship with indigenous communities and the land. He writes that covenant in scripture has always been between God, communities, and land, not just God and people. That's one of the ways that even disciples, I think we haven't always hit it right. We've said, oh, it's just God and people who make covenant, or people to people make covenant. But land is part of the covenant. We have fractured, those of us who descended from settlers, we have fractured this landscape. And we need to work to restore relationship, rebuild relationship with all of our neighbors, as well as the land. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I didn't go too much over in time. I'll leave it there for us to do some conversation together. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Nathan. That was really good and really helpful to put in context your own context of where you see that. And you made me look up the indigenous people where I grew up in Southern California, realizing that you know, we talked about the Spanish people that lived in Southern California before I got there, my family got there, but not the native peoples who were there even before that. So that was really helpful to me, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
We are going to break into small groups now, and breakout rooms to just have some conversation with each other. These are going to be small groups of about 4 people. Because we have such a large group, we had some facilitators named, but not every group will have a named facilitator because we have more people than we expected, which is wonderful. So we're going to spend just about 10 minutes in these groups to have some conversation. And I invite you to, in your conversation, think of one question or one point of conversation that you're going to want to share back to the whole group. And Dave, I believe you have a question to start us with. Is that right?
Sure. Thank you, Sandy. Yes, as you've all heard, is that Nathan spoke very well to us about what it means to be a part of a church, be a part of a country in the U.S. and Alaska and Canada that has ignored people living in this landscape. So why don't we take a few minutes and talk about what does it mean? And really, you know, it's kind of a two-part question. What does it mean, or how does it feel to learn that Christian theology, which you have been raised with, gave authority to colonization, genocide, ethnocide of our landscapes, that of the US, Alaska, and Canada? What does that mean? How does that feel? And when I say landscape, think of landscape in the fullness of landscape. Like Nathan said, the land. But the land is more than just the land. It's the plants and the animals and the people. So give that some thought, and we'll put the question in the chat, as well as we'll put it in your group. I believe we can do that as well. So I think that should get us going.
That, and I want to encourage you all, if in your groups, if you came up with a question or a comment you'd like to talk about, and we've only got a few minutes, so we're not going to get very far, but if you can throw, somebody from your group will throw those in the chat. I'm going to try to see if maybe I can throw Nathan off kilter here and kind of hit him with as many as we can. But you know, one question that came out of our group was, you know, how have disciples moved from kind of Campbell's supremacy understanding to who we are today? We have certainly aspects of our church that are much more inclusive, much less supremacist than then. You know, is there room to talk about how we've got there, and maybe how we keep moving the ball forward on that? And so, you know, maybe we start there, Nathan.
That's a great question. Thank you, and thank you all again for listening to me, and for just the honor of being here. So yeah, you know, and that's something I think I'm open to exploring too. I mean, I think there are always, you know, if you've ever done a core training within the denomination, sometimes we do a thing called the Wall of History. Shonda Jaw does a River of History. but like the wall of history, there's always there's resistance, right? There's the dominant kind of narrative, and then there's also points of resistance to that dominant narrative. So I think that's even true for the Stone Campbell movement. I think that we certainly need to sometimes pay attention to those and look for those. One of the things that sort of is a narrative that's interesting for us to think about is that 3 out of the 4 historic founders are immigrants, for instance, right? And that's something we've begun to talk about more, and I've heard more come up as a way as a lens for us to try to understand and tease out other narratives that we can think about that give us a different shape of identity, because as our movement, as we have changed, grown, we have celebrated our diversity in different ways and have tried to embrace that and move into that more inclusive table, more inclusive approach to ministry. So yeah, I think that's what we all need to do, and that's why I think I don't know that it's very helpful to say that we completely just say, and I read somewhere where someone did that, I don't really care what Campbell thinks. Well, you don't have to, and that's the good thing about being so Campbell. Yeah, and in a lot of ways, we are very divorced. I think if Alexander Campbell saw how some of us did church, he would be very confused. He had very particular, and he could be a real jerk. He had an ego, as I was reading more about him. But he also raised questions and things to us that give us permission in this tradition we have to ask and look for new narratives. So I think the exciting thing is that, and I reflected on this, a few years ago. I was at Orlando, I think, Dave, at the Orlando General Assembly. I remember a gathering. I think that was where the resolution came up to do a study of the Doctrine of Discovery. And here we are, just however many years later. I'm not going to my dates right now. And the conversation's unfolding. And I think that's the gift of the Stone Campbell, of some of our disciples' churches, is that we always have an invitation to raise new stories and new questions and bring the conversation out, even if it starts with 4 or 5 people. After Orlando, there was a cluster, about 5 or 6 of us around a table in the main area where we began to talk about next steps. And that little session where I just popped in, I think, for a little bit to listen and see what I could do, planted seeds that have continued to help this conversation grow. And so I think more regions are open to having, and that creates an opportunity for us to write new narratives, craft new narratives that help us live more into the movement for wholeness in a fragmented world.
Thank you, Nathan. You've touched on some good points there, and what I'm seeing echoed in some of the comments, and certainly in my group was there was certainly an emotional response to some of this information from folks. Some of us are maybe encountering what you've shared for the first time. So embarrassment is what I saw. Sympathy is another word. I would add shame. That's my wife's research interest, but I think, the shame of what our history has been, the shame of some of Alexander Campbell's behaviors that we don't want to claim, maybe, that kind of thing. And so that raises the question about, it's easy. I'm reframing some other folks' words here, so forgive me when I take your question and distort it a bit. But knowing how much of our God talk and how much of the ways that we understand and do our theology in our church are tradition bound, even to disciples. And what do we do then, knowing that that the things that we fall back onto, that we were raised in, perhaps, some of these prayers, some of these hymns, some of these ideas that we've known since we were this tall in the church, are kind of married to this problematic theology that was involved in conquest and genocide and theft. How do we start changing the way we God talk in a way that's meaningful? And I know you probably need a couple hours and maybe to finish your doctor project before you can answer that, but you got 3 minutes, so what can you give us?
And I would love to hear what you all think about that too. I mean, I think I'm a fellow student along that journey of trying to do that kind of work, because at times in my life when I have touched upon these things, those are the moments too when I have thought about walking away from church. It's that, I don't want to be a part of this. But I think some of that too is some of the white guilt, the white privilege of just even having that opportunity to say, I don't want to talk about that. I'm going to walk away, rather than say, how do I stay at the table and stay connected and stay listening and stay open to the possibilities that are there. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think we have a lot of great imagery and symbols within our within our tradition too, that I think we can reclaim and retell. I mean, the table is such a rich one for us, and we love the table. And I think it gives us one of those places where we can start in a space like that that offers us a different image or a different opportunity to connect and start there fresh, right? And I appreciate what Suzanne's saying here too. That, you know, I felt like the story that I did about Jesus and the Canaanite woman, and it's also as the Syrophoenician woman, and it's interesting because Syrophoenicians were considered merchants and traders, and that's another definition of the Canaanite, was a merchant trader, indicating some economic friction there, right? But I think for me that story has become liberating to me, because all right, Jesus is like me. Like, Jesus probably had some assumptions and some narratives and some theological ideas. Of course, some of you, if Jesus is perfect, then I know you maybe can't go there theologically, right? But if he could change, if his mind could be open, then that's the path I want to go. And I keep thinking about in our work, our anti-racism work, we want to move toward abundance. So we don't want to move toward an either or. We want a yes and, or and so how can we foster relationships and conversations with a wide array of folks? Interfaith conversations need be sitting and learning and listening and growing, so that we can then discover in those conversations some of our own blind spots and the areas that we need to do deeper theological work. Now, I think our denomination as a whole has a lot of work to do around land and owning our dysfunction around all how we have treated land and how we treated new church starts and things. And so, you know, our most I don't want to say profitable, that's not the right word, but I think our most financially strong institutions are foundations and land-related organizations within our institutions. So I think there's work that needs to be done around that we are doing, and some are doing, I think, around finding, really truly embracing ways to be church beyond this model of land. And so I think land is one of those theological points I'm going to continue to kind of wrestle with myself and try to live into. And I say all of this by saying I'm a pastor, and I'm concerned with my budget, and I'm concerned with how we use our property and all this. You know, it seems like sometimes you enter into these conversations, you're in two worlds. You're moving into a difficult and challenging space. So I don't think I did a great job answering that question, but I just say I'm open to your thoughts too. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna follow up your response with an amen and say, yes, it's the beginning of the work, not the ending. And I sure didn't expect you to provide us with an answer that we could go boilerplate today. So I recognize it's 11:31, which means technically we're out of time, but I already talked to the boss, and she said if we want to go for just a few more minutes, for those of you who might be willing to stay around, we were gonna, for those during lunch for conversation. So Nathan, if you had just a few more minutes, maybe another
Sure.
5 or 10 minutes, we could kind of keep this conversation going just a bit longer. I want to honor your time too. You've been very generous with us, and I don't want to step on that, but if that's all right with you, we'll kind of continue this a little further. So disciples, I know you heard him talking about communion as our great resource, right? And we all love it. That's how I know that you're a fellow colleague disciple, because once we get going on something, we always end up back at the communion table, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe the question that I'm seeing in this is we're talking about ways to shift our thinking, because I sense there is a theological, I don't know if problem's the word I want to use, but we need to challenge some of our assumptions. And the joy of being a disciple is we can. Our history is kind of grounded in that. But I'm wondering if maybe another thing to question would be to challenge some of our assumptions in our practices, such as communion. For me, growing up in a church where communion was a very quiet, individualistic moment where we passed the trays, you took your bread and your cup, and you ate them and prayed quietly, which is all nice and well. But you're talking about the table as a resource for building community and moving us, beyond kind of other ways of thinking. Is there space in that for changing how we do these practices in our worship to kind of embody a theological shift? And again, I'm probably treading on your D-Men project or something here, and into territory you're not prepared for. But we are spitballing together here today as disciples, and I think that's something that we're allowed to do, which is a blessing.
This is a great question. Yeah, and I think it is. I mean, I think the table is important to me, and growing up in a church, like I said, where you have this, as I shared, this reality that like we're a segregated church, and yet we point to this non-segregated table and the clashes of that, and that sort of almost captures the American religious experience in so many ways, that we sometimes have these lofty things, and then we'll bar one another away from it. We will draw boundaries and lines from one another. In my experience, just growing up too in Anadarko, and then going to college with so many good Navajo, Kiowa, Comanche friends who just really blessed me. They blessed me even when I wasn't really looking for anything. They said I served as the treasurer for the Native American Student Council, and they said, Nathan, you need to be in the student council, the Native American Student Council. I'm not Native, like I'm white. I'm a white guy, But they said, but you're from Anadarko, which gives you a sense of kind of what it is to grow up in Anadarko. Like it's a different little experience sometimes. But I've had those experiences throughout my life of finding welcome in places where I didn't even ask for it, and finding out that the table was broader than just the cup and the bread, right? What happens before and what happens after are also part of the table fellowship and the table experience. I remember one of my friends, we went over for her birthday party in college, and Navajo family, and I went thinking, all right, cool. At least today, this is fun. We'll have some fun. We'll eat some birthday cake. My friend will open her presents. That's what I expected. But here we gather with the family, intergenerational, wonderful family. I'm still very close to them, and I'm like, all right, it's birthday time. Let's get to the presents. Let's get to the cake. That's what I grew up. That's my context. Is you get to the present. That's what matters about a birthday. But before they got to that table moment there, they had the table moment before, which was they stopped, they gathered together, and they began to share stories about their loved one, my friend. We laughed and we cried and we hugged, and it was amazing. And then afterwards I was like, oh, there's more to this than cake. Presents. There's more to the table than even this cup and the bread we experience. And so even how we engage and envision and how we invite, what we do before and afterwards. And serving a multicultural congregation, one of the things we have argued about, and mostly it's my white folks, that we argue we eat too much. We do too much around eating. We don't have time to eat all the time. We got to come and just do the work. Let's do the work. But then when we talk to our other diverse immigrant families and African-American families and Caribbean families, Indian families, Korean families, there's something about being together that requires food. It requires that sacred conversation moment after church, even if it's after every Sunday. And my white leaders will go, God, do we have to do it every Sunday? I got other things. I got a game to catch. And they understand that community is formed in those kinds of liminal spaces. And so the table, how do we even expand that image of the table and to that even before and after, as we understand what our practice is and what is going to be sustaining and is going to feed us. And I know there are churches and faith communities in Northern Lights, I'm sure, that are already doing that work. So that's great.
Oh, thank you, Nathan. That's I appreciate your reflections on that and doing that on the fly. I share a lot of your thoughts there, and I think there's much we can grow in around that practice. It's one of our gifts I think we have to offer, not just to each other but the world. Is if we as soon as we figure it out, we have something to offer. So I think the last thing, just knowing, like I said, I want to be conscious of everybody's time. I'm thinking back to you were laughing there as you were invited onto a council and going, but I'm a white guy. Why are you bringing in here? But you have those resources of having grown up in Anadarko, and I share the Phillips experience. And my first formal call was in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the heart of the Western Cherokees, and that was a learning experience for me. I had grown up in rural Missouri and did not have this background. And so I'm thinking I had that gift of being able to experience it later. You were raised in it. We had this conversation that some of us are kind of really getting into these questions, really into the weeds, at least for maybe the first time. What are some of the resources we maybe have? What are some of the ways? And I want to ask you, as a fellow white guy, rather than putting this on our neighbors of color, to force them to do us one more turn by making them our educators. How do we educate ourselves? What resources do we do? What practices should we engage into to kind of grow and become better at that? Because I think that's probably something that all of us in this room, we still have something to learn, I think. So maybe you can help us step down that road as kind of our last question here.
It's a great question. And I'll tell you one of my, a couple of things. We had Mark Charles come and speak at the church and do an after session with us. And he's based in DC. He's written a book. He's a Navajo speaker. He was actually a presidential candidate. He's a very interesting guy, a strong evangelical Christian and very active. And he's written a book called Unsettling Truths with Sung Chan Ra, which I do recommend. One of the stories he shared that really resonated with me was a sort of a parable of how he describes this context in which we are. He says, and I'm gonna paraphrase very quickly because I can't do his full thing justice. But he says, this country in which we live, this moment in which we live, is like there's a large house, and with the people who lived in the house, the grandmother lives in that house by herself, but over time the family either moves away, and eventually the grandma is put up in the far corner of the house and locked in a room as she's gotten older and older and more weak and more sick. And meanwhile, new people have come into this room. They've come in and just taken over and started living in this house. And he says, before you even get to a question of, well, maybe we should kick people out, he says, maybe we should start by going and listening to the grandmother. First things first is to go acknowledge the grandmother's presence, sit and hold her hand and let her know that we know she's there, and listen to her stories and her wisdom and be with her. That there's an aspect too of even in this work for white folks is that we really got to listen. And so, Winter Talk and are resources like this for us to listen and to be engaged in conversation, but also take advantages of those opportunities in communities. Now with Zoom, oh wow, to be able to listen to people and listen to stories, and I've put some feelers out here locally to do just that with the Piscataway Conoy tribe here in Maryland, and haven't had a chance to really go deeper on that because of the pandemic. But my invitation is not going to be come and we want to go to where you are and we want to listen. We just want to come and listen what's going on. Like tell us what are you all struggling with. We're not coming as a mission trip. We're not going to give away coloring books or I don't know, whatever we think. We're not going to do VBS or we just want to come and bring folks and just listen, sit together and listen. And so what a gift that is. And of course, long-term too, for my doctor of ministry work too, I'm really going to wrestle with land reparation. I really want as disciples for us to sit with that question and think about what it is. And even if it's not giving back land, what does, as I finished my talk with the quote from Munther Isaac, what is covenant? What does it mean to be in right relationship with the land, God, and with community? What is it? What are other ways that we as a church can live into that's about sharing our resources abundantly and seeing this land as a gift from God, which is also a great theme of the Bible, and not something that that is necessarily ours. It's something that we steward. And if we steward it, then we are free and open to share it and share its resources freely so that all are blessed and all enjoy the fruits of the land. So those are a couple of resources that I lift up. You know, Munther Isaac, I mean, this book has been really interesting for me. He is Palestinian, but what I found about my trip to Israel and Palestine and to the border was that these conversations all connect. Those border walls directly connect to colonialization and conquest, protecting what is ours. This is mine. I'm going to build a wall so you can't come and get what is mine. And in Israel and Palestine, there are walls and there's security apparatus. My first experience in Israel was feeling like this feels like an American colony. Like this feels strange, like I've been here before. And so then to sit with the Palestinians and hear as they are doing the same kind of work of reimagining what is shared land and what is just living. That's not just about another round of conquest, but around sharing and everyone flourishing together.
Thank you, Nathan. I know, friends, we could carry this on for a long time, and I also know not only can the mind only take what the butt can tolerate, but also if the stomach's rumbling, the mind ain't paying attention either. So we do need to take that time for lunch. I apologize for not being able to get to everybody's comments or questions today in the time we had, and I'll encourage you all, rather than turning on our microphones, if you know how to use your reactions, I want to give my thanks and a big round of quiet, not ear-shattering applause to Nathan, to say thank you for being here and the gift of your time and sharing with us. It was a blessing to have you here. I know, and we look forward to hearing more from John in the second half. I'm excited for that as well, but grateful for your time, for coming in and joining us from all the way across the country. It's just a joy and a blessing to have this opportunity to grow with you. Hopefully we'll be able to have more conversations again.
Thank you so much.